12 hours, 6 signatures, 1 political shockwave. By the time cameras switched on and television networks understood what had happened, the doors were already closed. The documents had already been signed. The phones inside Washington were already ringing. And somewhere between those calls, one question started moving through political offices, trade desks, and financial markets with uncomfortable speed. What if the pressure campaign that was designed to isolate Canada had done the exact opposite? What if every move intended to force a concession had quietly created a new alliance instead? Because if that happened, this was no longer about tariffs. It was no longer about negotiations. It was no longer about one disagreement between two governments. This was about whether the global system had started reorganizing itself while America was looking somewhere else. For months, the public story looked simple. Pressure creates results. Strength creates leverage. And leverage forces negotiation. That was the assumption repeated again and again across interviews, policy discussions, and economic commentary. The expectation was straightforward. Canada depended heavily on American trade. Canada needed access. Canada needed stability. Canada needed Washington more than Washington needed Ottawa. On paper, the math appeared obvious, but sometimes political strategy has a hidden weakness. It becomes dangerous when leaders begin believing that everyone else is playing the same game under the same rules. Because outside public view, something else had started happening. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, very quietly. There were no emergency press conferences, no leaked documents appearing in newspapers, no dramatic statements from government officials warning that a major shift was underway. There were only small movements, small meetings, small decisions that, by themselves, looked ordinary. A trade discussion here. An energy meeting there. A technology conference in another city. Individually, nothing looked important. Collectively, they were pieces of a larger structure that almost nobody noticed. And that larger structure had one central idea. If access becomes uncertain, create alternatives. If pressure increases, reduce dependence. If one door starts closing, build 6 new doors. The problem was that almost everyone watching these events believed they were observing isolated conversations rather than connected strategy. Financial analysts looked at energy meetings and saw energy meetings. Diplomatic observers looked at technology agreements and saw technology agreements. Trade officials looked at supply chain discussions and saw supply chain discussions. Nobody saw a larger picture because nobody expected one to exist, and expectations can become blind spots. Inside Ottawa, the calculations were changing, not because officials believed they could overpower the United States, not because they believed they could replace the American economy, because they believed something much simpler. They believed predictability matters. Businesses require predictability. Investors require predictability. Supply chains require predictability. Markets can tolerate expensive conditions. Markets can tolerate difficult conditions. Markets can even tolerate political tension. But markets hate uncertainty. And uncertainty had become the problem. When companies cannot predict next year's tariffs, investment slows. When manufacturers cannot predict future restrictions, expansion stops. When governments cannot predict future policy decisions, alternative plans suddenly become attractive. Very attractive. Across Europe and across Asia, leaders had started facing similar questions. Questions nobody wanted to discuss publicly. What happens if supply chains become political weapons? What happens if economic relationships become unstable? What happens if dependence becomes risk? The answers were uncomfortable, because those questions did not affect only Canada. Those questions affected everyone. And that is where the situation began changing. Not in public. Behind closed doors. Conversations became meetings. Meetings became proposals. Proposals became working groups. Working groups became draft agreements. Then something strange happened. Nobody announced any of it. Normally, large international negotiations create noise. Leaks happen. Rumors spread. Reporters discover details. Political opponents start asking questions. But this time, almost nothing escaped. Silence remained in place. Month after month. until people stopped paying attention completely. And that may have been the most important development of all, because the moment people stop watching is often the moment real movement begins. Meanwhile, the public battle continued. Statements were made, positions hardened, pressure increased, and television coverage focused on the conflict everyone could see. Trump versus Canada, tariffs versus trade, strength versus resistance. But while cameras stayed pointed toward the visible fight, another process continued in the background, piece by piece, meeting by meeting, agreement by agreement. A second system was slowly taking shape. Nobody knew how large it had become, nobody knew how far it had gone, and nobody understood that somewhere ahead there was a specific morning waiting on the calendar. A morning where 6 signatures would arrive almost simultaneously. A morning where headlines would begin moving faster than governments. A morning where people inside Washington would start asking a question they never expected to ask. When exactly did this happen? Because by the time anyone realized something had changed, the clock had already started running. The first sign that something unusual was happening did not come from a government announcement. It came from silence. Not ordinary silence. Not the normal pause between negotiations and public statements. A different kind of silence. The kind that begins to feel strange only after people realize they expected noise and never received it. Because large international deals are rarely invisible. Someone talks, someone leaks, someone says too much during a private meeting. Someone close to the process tells a journalist that something important may be developing. That is how major stories usually begin. Tiny cracks appear before the wall finally breaks. But this time, there were no cracks. For almost 11 months, there was nothing. No rumors moving through policy circles. No reports from trade insiders. No sudden speculation from financial media. No indication that 6 different frameworks involving 6 major partners were advancing at the same time. And that raised a question later that still makes analysts uncomfortable. How do 6 separate negotiations remain hidden simultaneously? Because keeping one secret is difficult. Keeping 6 secrets at once is nearly impossible, unless secrecy itself becomes part of the strategy. And according to people familiar with how these arrangements unfolded, that appears to be exactly what happened. The structure was built like separate rooms inside a building. Each room had a door. Each room had its own participants. Each room had its own conversations. But almost nobody was allowed to walk through every door. One negotiation team discussed energy. Another handled manufacturing. Another worked through digital services. Another focused on critical minerals. Information moved vertically rather than horizontally. People knew what they needed to know. Nothing more. Imagine trying to complete a giant puzzle where every person holds only a few pieces and nobody can see the picture printed on the box. That was the system. And systems like that create something powerful. They create invisibility. Meanwhile, outside those rooms, the public narrative continued moving in a completely different direction. Headlines focused on political confrontation. Economic commentators debated tariffs. Television panels argued over winners and losers. Attention remained fixed on visible conflict. And visible conflict has an interesting effect. It attracts all the light. Everything outside that light becomes harder to notice. The pressure campaign against Canada continued to dominate discussion. The assumption remained unchanged. Eventually, pressure creates limits. Eventually, pressure forces compromise. Eventually, pressure becomes stronger than resistance. The belief sounded logical. Many people accepted it. But there was one problem. Nobody stopped to ask what Canada was doing during that time. Because countries do not simply freeze while pressure increases. Governments adapt. Businesses adapt. Supply chains adapt. And sometimes adaptation does not look dramatic while it is happening. Sometimes adaptation looks boring. A meeting in Tokyo, a policy discussion in London, a technology conference in Seoul, a resource agreement in Australia, a regulatory discussion involving European partners. Individually, each event looked small enough to ignore. But viewed together, they formed lines, and those lines eventually connected. Some analysts would later compare the process to building bridges in fog. You cannot see where the bridge ends while construction is happening. You only see workers disappearing into mist. Nothing appears connected. Nothing appears complete. Then one morning the fog lifts, and suddenly there is an entire structure standing where empty space used to be. That is what happened. But nobody understood it yet. Not in Washington, not in financial markets, not even among many trade observers. Because the visible story still looked stronger. Trump had spent months presenting a clear argument. America possessed leverage. America possessed market power. America possessed economic scale. And those statements were not imaginary. The United States remained the largest economy in the world. Access to American markets still mattered enormously. Losing that access carried real consequences. But there is another reality in global trade that often receives less attention. Scale matters. Dependence matters more. Because if nations begin asking whether dependence creates vulnerability, behavior starts changing. Not immediately, not dramatically, quietly. The first move is usually diversification. Then comes cooperation. Then come agreements. Then come systems. And systems become difficult to reverse. Very difficult. By now, pieces were moving in multiple countries at once. Energy infrastructure discussions accelerated. Supply chain reviews expanded. Technology partnerships advanced. Regulatory frameworks moved closer together. The machinery was already operating. Most people simply could not hear it. Then came the week everything changed. Not because governments suddenly started negotiating. Those negotiations were already finished. Not because new discussions suddenly appeared. Those discussions had already happened. No, the week everything changed was the week signatures approached. Because once signatures arrive, secrecy starts running out of time. And somewhere inside government offices, diplomatic channels, and financial institutions, calendars were beginning to close in on a specific date. A date almost nobody outside the process understood. A date that would compress 11 months of invisible movement into less than 1 hour. And when that hour arrived, the reaction inside Washington would not begin with anger. It would begin with confusion. Confusion spreads differently than panic. Panic is loud. Confusion is quiet. Panic runs through hallways. Confusion stays in rooms. It sits between sentences. It appears in pauses during phone calls. It shows itself when people begin asking the same question again and again, hoping the answer changes. Because confusion usually begins with one dangerous realization. Something happened, and nobody understands how. Inside Washington, information started arriving in fragments. Not complete reports, not polished briefings. Fragments. A headline appearing on one screen, a trade summary moving across another, a notification from an international desk, a call from an advisor asking whether anyone had seen the announcement. Then another call. Then another. Within minutes, something unusual became obvious. The pieces did not fit together. At first, people assumed there had been a mistake. 6 frameworks? Simultaneously? No. That could not be correct. Maybe preliminary discussions. Maybe letters of intent. Maybe symbolic agreements designed for political theater. Because that happens all the time. Governments sign memorandums. Governments announce partnerships. Governments create headlines before creating substance. Everyone had seen it before. Large words, small actions, big announcements, limited consequences. So the initial reaction remained calm, until details started arriving. And details have a way of changing rooms. The first documents showed implementation schedules. The second documents showed regulatory structures. The third documents showed infrastructure commitments. Then analysts began noticing something else. Dates. Dates attached to projects. Dates attached to approvals. Dates attached to facilities. Dates attached to contracts. And many of those dates pointed backward. Months backward. Not days, not weeks, months. Suddenly, the timeline stopped making sense because these agreements had not appeared overnight. These agreements had been moving quietly beneath the surface for nearly a year. That was when confusion started changing shape. Now the questions became sharper. Who knew? How many people knew? And perhaps most importantly, who did not know? Because political strategy depends heavily on assumptions. Every government makes them. Every administration makes them. Assumptions about allies. Assumptions about rivals. Assumptions about what others are likely to do under pressure. Most of the time, those assumptions work. Until they don't. And when assumptions fail, systems built around those assumptions begin shaking. Not collapsing. Shaking. Trump had spent months framing the conflict around leverage. The argument was direct. America represented scale. America represented access. America represented economic gravity. And again, that logic was not irrational. The United States still sat at the center of enormous global systems. But there was another possibility that had received much less attention. What if pressure was creating adaptation faster than expected? What if countries were not simply absorbing pressure? What if they were reorganizing around it? Because if that was happening, then the situation was changing from negotiation into something larger, something structural. And structural changes are different. You can reverse a policy, you can change a tariff, you can replace an agreement, but systems that connect countries together become harder to unwind once they start operating. Every connection creates another connection. Every agreement creates another dependency. Every dependency creates another incentive to stay together. Piece by piece, momentum starts building. And momentum can become powerful. Very powerful. Meanwhile, outside government offices, markets had begun noticing movement of their own. Energy companies started reviewing projections. Manufacturing analysts began updating assumptions. Supply chain experts started asking new questions, because if resources moved in different directions, factories move. If factories move, investment moves. And if investment moves, the map starts changing. Slowly at first, then all at once. By now, the story was no longer about 6 signatures. It was becoming a story about consequences. Because signatures are easy. Consequences are difficult, very difficult. And somewhere in the middle of that growing uncertainty, another realization was beginning to emerge, one that nobody had expected. The agreements themselves were only the first surprise. The real surprise was who had signed them. Because when the names finally appeared together on a single page, the room became quiet again.